Hey guys, for this next video, we're going to look at David Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion. I'm going to try to be as brief as possible, but hopefully articulate enough that you get something from the video and come out with a little better understanding of the reading itself, which I expect was probably one of the more difficult readings that you've come across so far in this class. With this reading, we have David Hume essentially contesting the traditional conventional arguments for the nature of God. He's got three characters in this particular work, a dialogue taking place between Philo, who is really Hume's mouthpiece, and then we also have Cleanthes and Demea. With Cleanthes, we have an empiricist and somebody who thinks that we can know or understand something about God based on our experiences in this world. And then we have Demea, who's a rationalist, and Demea is not going to rely on your experience in this world to prove anything about God, but is going to rely rather on reason for understanding about God. Excuse me. So if we just kind of look at the very start of this reading, and if you do have your books, you can, maybe just follow along, maybe pause and then continue on with this video as we go here to get your place. But when we start on page 177, we find that, Cleanthes and Demea are in discussion. And Cleanthes is criticizing Demea in his perspective of this sort of incomprehensible deity, So if God is sort of, beyond us, right, which we would expect is probably fair to a degree, that, if there's a creator God out there and this whole universe came from this God, we're here for, 50, 60, 70, 80 years, we know nothing, we're very, very limited. And so whatever this God is just really beyond human understanding, human, finitude and, those sorts of things, right? So to me, it's kind of arguing that, right? God's, really kind of transcendent and really incomprehensible, but God is there, of course. But Cleanthes criticizes Demea here, and Cleanthes criticizes Demea. Why? Well, what if God is beyond us? What if God is incomprehensible? Is there any meaning in God if that's the case, right? What's the point to a God that we can never really know or understand? Okay, so that's Cleanthes' a sort of argument against Demea. If you turn the page, page 178, you're going to find Demea's attack against Cleanthes. And what Cleanthes is basically going to do is say, well, we can understand something about God based on, what we know about the world or what we know about human nature, right? So if we took, maybe a biblical view, right, that God created humankind in God's image and likeness, right? Well, then we say, okay, we're not as great as God is, but God's kind of like us, right? God's, loving, God is, kind, God is just, but, obviously to a sort of superior degree than we are. But Demea attacks Cleanthes on this, right? Because, we are so far from being what we would like to be that to assign any kind of, attributes to God, based on human nature, it just seems faulty, maybe even presumptuous. It just seems like a really big leap, If we based our understanding of God, on what we know of ourselves, God seems kind of fickle then, kind of, morality is arbitrary, development is slow, it's just really, really difficult to come to this perfect and immutable, sort of idea about God if we base what we know of God off of sort of human nature. All right, it just seems like a leap we can't really take, and a leap from what we know about ourselves to what we can know about God. That's just too great of a leap for Demea to sort of swallow there. When we move on, we find that Philo enters the picture, right? And Philo is really, going to attack, both of these characters and their perspectives. And what Philo is going to do is try to not attack the argument from the outside looking in, but actually attack the argument, from the inside. He's going to try to get inside the tradition and show, the faults within, sort of the logic and explanations of that tradition. So if we look at, for example, page 179, what we find is, this is the beginning of 179, that first column. We have Philo or Hume here basically saying, for a long time, we've had this sort of notion that, God is this immaterial, being, and that this material world came from this God. When we look at this material world, we see that, all things, are related by cause and effect. Nothing just sort of, a book doesn't just like, fly off the table or something like that, right? Gravity holds it down. And so we have sort of cause and effect relationships, right? Things stay at rest because gravity holds it there. Cause and effect relationships. All things in this material world seem to operate by cause and effect. But we do find one place where this doesn't seem to be the case, and that's this sort of immaterial, God or mental world, i.e. God that exists that we came from, right? So what's the understanding? Well, this world operates by cause and effect, and it came from something, God, that was not caused by anything else, right? God always was. God was uncreated. Well, Hume's just questioning that essentially on page 179. Hume saying, if everything in this sort of material world required a cause, well, if there's some other sort of immaterial world, world of God out there, why wouldn't that require a cause just as this world does, essentially? And it's really an interesting question, right? If everything that we know requires a cause, why does a sort of world of God not require a cause? How is it that God just sort of is and God always was, and there was no cause to God, if that makes sense, okay? If you're feeling a little confused by this, I'll try to clarify with sort of Hume's next point. It's basically this, and this is continued on page 179. The point is, let's say for the sake of argument that this material world did come from God and that God was uncaused, right? God always was and wasn't caused by anything else. What does this mean? It means that there's at least one thing that exists in the world that was not caused, and that would be God. Well, what's Hume's point to this? Hume's point is this. If we can suggest that there's at least one thing that exists that was not caused, why does that thing have to be God? Why couldn't that thing actually be the material world itself? So what we usually argue is, this material world came from somewhere, that somewhere is God, and that God was not caused. Well, for Hume, it's a step that we don't necessarily need. If there has to be at least one thing that was uncaused for this world to exist, why couldn't that uncaused thing just be this material world itself? All right, pretty interesting perspective by Hume. And the other thing that we might add to this is, Hume isn't making the claim that God doesn't exist necessarily. What he's saying is, there's other possibilities, all right? And those other possibilities are actually just as reasonable and just as logical. And they don't contradict themselves, what else here? And so if we look at Hume's sort of conclusion to part 4, he says the following, right? An ideal system arranged of itself without a precedent design is not a whit more explicable than a material one which attains its order in a like manner. nor is there any more difficulty in the latter supposition than in the former. So again, he's really just making this point that if there is something that came from nothing or something that always was, right, that wasn't caused by anything, why does that have to be God? Why couldn't that just be the material world itself? All right. So I think pretty scary thought for a lot of people, particularly of religious faith. But the question philosophically is there merit in Hume's point? And that is really the question that you have to address in your response for this particular reading. Is Hume successful in challenging the conventional notions about the nature and the existence of God? It's not to say that his arguments are correct. It's to beg the question of whether or not there's at least merit in the questions that he asks. Is it possible that if God does exist, that we very, very poorly understand, or even maybe wrongly understand what this God is or how this God operates, that sort of a thing? There could be a number of other possibilities beyond just the ones that we've sort of considered. All right, thanks.